Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the government minister, Steve Baker, was forced to apologise in the House of Commons today for appearing to suggest that some civil servants were conspiring against Brexit. It's meant yet more trouble on the Tory benches while Theresa May has been away. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in Westminster now. Michael, what's the word there?
Well, yesterday, Cathy, in the House of Commons, Jacob Rees Mogg, the Brexiteer Tory backbencher, asked Steve Baker, the Brexit minister, about a suggestion based on what appears to be an erroneous account attributed to Charles Grant, erroneously attributed to Charles Grant, whether civil servants in the Treasury had deliberately constructed a model whereby the only way in which Britain wouldn't be worse off under Brexit would be if we remained in the customs union. Steve Baker responded yesterday in saying that was essentially correct. Well, today he had to come along to the House of Commons and issue this embarrassing apology.
I accept that I should have corrected or dismissed the premise of my honourable friend's question. I have apologised to Mr Charles Grant, who is an honest and trustworthy man. As I have put on record many times, I have the highest regard for our hard-working civil servants. I'm grateful for this early opportunity to correct the record, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I apologise to the House.
Yeah. Well, as for Jacob Rees Mogg, he's been involved tonight in what looked like some fairly ugly scuffles at a student meeting at the University of the West of England. He hasn't been apologising today. On the contrary, he says that a published recording of a lunch with Charles Grant rather suggests that officials in the Treasury or the Chancellor have indeed been conspiring to undermine Brexit and push for a soft Brexit. Meanwhile, today, splits within the Cabinet. The split within the Cabinet has become more apparent as Theresa May and Liam Fox have been flying back from China. Before he left to return to London, Liam Fox did an interview with Bloomberg in which he said that which he denounced the idea of any customs union between Britain and the EU as being incompatible with Britain striking its own trade deals with other countries. Now, that is not the line taken by Theresa May in Downing Street. She says she has an open mind on this. All options are now still open. But with Michel Barnier in London on Monday to resume the negotiations and to meet Mrs May and David Davis and important meetings of cabinet ministers, these issues are going to have to be resolved fairly soon as to what stance, what kind of relationship Britain does indeed want with the European Union after Brexit.
Michael, thanks very much.
A prominent Conservative MP has stepped up his criticism of civil servants at the Treasury, accusing them of fiddling the figures in Brexit forecasts in order to make the case for the UK remaining in the EU's customs union. Jacob Rees Mogg, who was caught in a scuffle last night when protesters disrupted a meeting he was attending at the University of the West of England, told the Today programme on Radio 4 that Treasury forecasts about the impact of Brexit were clearly politically influenced.
With the referendum and with the EU, the Treasury has gone back to making forecasts. It was politically advantageous for them in the past.
That's very clear.
It's the same now. So yes, I do think they're fiddling the figures.
Well, our political correspondent Eleanor Garnier is with me, and that phrase, Eleanor, fiddling the figures, I mean, he seems to be saying clearly it was deliberate as far as he's concerned.
And for the second time this week, he has questioned the impartiality of civil servants. And now the FDA union, which represents senior officials in Whitehall, has hit back, saying Mr Rees Mogg is peddling unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. And they've called on Theresa May to come out and make an unequivocal statement in support of the civil service. But really, this is about much more than an MP complaining about Treasury figures he doesn't like. Mr Rees Mogg is an ardent Leave campaigner. He leads a group of Tory Brexiteers in the Commons on whom Mrs May's future may well one day depend. And that group are worried that the Prime Minister is shying away from completely disentangling the UK from the EU when we leave. And all this comes ahead of an extremely big week for Theresa May on Brexit. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, will be in Downing Street on Monday for talks, and then there are key ministerial meetings later in the week on the UK's future relationship with the EU. So I think this is about Mr Rees Mogg putting pressure on Theresa May, ratcheting up that pressure, just as she goes into the next round of extremely difficult negotiations.
All right, Eleanor. Thank you, Eleanor Garnier.
Welcome back to Sky News this evening. Now, leading Tory Brexiteer Jacob Rees Mogg has accused Treasury officials of fiddling the figures on Brexit to keep the UK in the EU's customs union. It's after claims that the Treasury had deliberately created an economic model that made all other options look bad. That's something the Treasury denies.
With these forecasts, it all depends on the information you put in the first place, and they put in assumptions that lead to their conclusions. So they are determined by the measures they put in, and those measures, I think, are fundamentally wrong. But you need to remember that George Osborne thought that the Treasury used to fiddle the figures, and that's why he set up the Office for Budget Responsibility, because he felt that the Treasury, under Gordon Brown's Chancellorship and Prime Ministership, just invented the forecasts to meet the political needs of their political masters. And I'm afraid I think the same thing is happening again.
Let's go to East Tilbury in Essex to speak to Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA. That's the union which represents civil service leaders. Dave, thanks for your time. So Mr Rees Mogg there basically claiming that conclusions that your civil servants reach are determined by measures that are fundamentally wrong. What do you think?
Well, the problem with Jacob Rees Mogg is he's incapable of understanding how the civil service works. Because he has no sense of public service, he can't understand that civil servants can put aside their political beliefs to act in the public interest and provide the best advice to ministers. He's incapable of that, and he can't conceptualise how anyone else is capable of it, and that's the problem. And basically, he's got to put up or shut up. If he's going to make these sorts of accusations against the civil service, he's got to produce some evidence. And it's about time the Prime Minister and ministers in the Cabinet come out and defended the civil service.
So when he says that the forecasts produced again by civil servants in your union designed to a particular end, and that end is to show the only thing we should do is stay in the customs union, I take your point, he hasn't produced any evidence for that, but I think he's probably citing trends of recent times that say we should stay in the customs union. That does not stack up to you.
No, it doesn't stack up. And ultimately, the Treasury are there to advise ministers. Ministers ultimately make a decision. And what Jacob Rees Mogg doesn't like is what those conclusions are, what that evidence has shown. And he's reckless enough to try and attack and undermine the civil service simply because it doesn't give the message that he wants. And you know, that is beneath him as a parliamentarian. We saw him during the week refusing to apologise, despite him peddling a myth that was proven to be untrue. And so he's undermining his own position. But what I really need, and what I think civil servants want, is for the government to come out and defend the civil service. They can't allow these sorts of accusations to go unchallenged.
You know, Steve Baker, who's been embroiled in this row and originally seemed to agree with Mr Rees Mogg but then clarified his remarks, said on Twitter, "I have the highest regard for our hard-working civil servants." You know, that's the government coming out and backing you. What more could someone like that do?
So Steve Baker on Tuesday said that no matter what Treasury officials produced as an analysis, he would never believe it. He was dragged back to the Commons on Wednesday to say those sorts of warm words, and then on Thursday he had his little double act with Jacob Rees Mogg around those accusations that were proven to be untrue. So I think Steve Baker saying at any one point in time, "I have the greatest respect for civil servants," will be hollow words with all of the other comments that he's been making this week.
I just want to ask you on Brexit specifically, because we've got you on at the moment, how are staffing levels in the civil service, in your opinion? We hear that an extra 8,000 since the referendum. In your opinion, are Whitehall departments fully staffed to deliver a Brexit?
Well, you've got to understand the context here. The civil service is at its lowest level since the Second World War. It has lost over 100,000 staff in 10 years, and whilst there has been some increase in staffing around the demands of Brexit, they're being expected to deliver the government's agenda as well as deliver Brexit. So it's against a backdrop of significant reductions that government departments have still got to deliver for this.
So you don't think there are enough civil servants working in you don't think there are enough civil servants working in Whitehall to deliver Brexit and a competent agenda?
I think if you look at the challenge that Brexit places upon the government and upon the civil service, why would you want to do that on the cheap? So whilst, yes, there have been some additional staffing increases in some departments to deliver Brexit, the reality of it is the test will be once we know what Brexit looks like, because depending upon the Brexit deal that's done, it will depend upon whether we need 2, 3, 4 or 5,000 extra border staff, as well as all of the issues around areas like agriculture, fisheries, climate and tax. So I think the jury's out on whether the civil service has enough resources to cope with Brexit.
OK, Dave Penman, thanks for taking the time to speak to us.
Now, the Conservative MP, Jacob Rees Mogg, has criticised Treasury officials again, this time accusing them of fiddling the figures on Brexit to keep Britain in the single market. Earlier this week, he claimed civil servants at the department had developed an economic model which made other options look bad, a claim strongly denied by the Treasury. Here's Jenny Longdon.
He was caught in a scuffle with protesters last night while speaking at a university debate about Brexit, but that didn't stop him from staying and talking to students. This morning, Jacob Rees Mogg showed his resolve again, refusing to back down over these comments he made in Parliament this week.
Will my honourable friend, the Minister and Member for Wickham, confirm that he heard from Charles Grant for the Centre of European Research that officials in the Treasury had deliberately developed a model to show that all options other than staying in the customs union were bad, and that officials intended to use this to influence policy?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to say that my honourable friend's account is essentially correct.
But 24 hours later, an audio recording emerged proving Mr. Grant had been misquoted.
In the context of that audio, I accept that I should have corrected or dismissed the premise of my honourable friend's question.
Rather than apologise, Mr. Rees Mogg stepped up his attack on the Treasury this morning.
The Treasury has gone back to making forecasts. It was politically advantageous for them in the past.
That's very clear.
It's the same now. So yes, I do think they're fiddling the figures.
The Treasury responded by saying officials and ministers were working hard to secure the best deal for Britain.
Well, joining me now from West London is the Labour MP, Ben Bradshaw, who's a member of the pro-European Union group Open Britain and was a former cabinet minister himself. And from Hampshire, the Conservative MEP, Daniel Hannan, one of the founders of the Vote Leave campaign. Daniel Hannan, this is straight out of Trump tactics, isn't it? Make something up, refuse to apologise and then double down on it. It brings politics into disrepute, surely.
Well, I think it's been confirmed that Charles Grant did say that the Treasury had an agenda. That's different from saying that they deliberately cooked the figures, but I don't think there's any doubt that they have an outcome that they prefer.
He didn't say agenda.
It's very clear that they've been wrong up until now.
When did he say agenda?
He said they want to. They're determined to keep us in the He said they're determined to keep us in the customs union. And, you know, let's actually look at something which is not speculation, but is hard fact. During the campaign, the Treasury said that our GDP, if we voted leave, would fall by between 3% and 6% in the 2 years after the campaign. We're getting fairly close to that now. It's actually risen by 1.8 and 1.9%. They said that unemployment by now would have risen by around 500,000. It's actually fallen by about that amount.
We're off the point now.
So
we're off the point now.
Well, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure this is off the point.
I'm trying to keep us to what Jacob Rees Mogg said.
If you're determined to get to a particular outcome, then you will maybe it'll be a subconscious thing. Maybe it won't be a deliberate thing. But all human beings tend to be a little bit results-driven. And if you're emotionally committed to keeping us in the closest possible union, then that's going to be something that affects your work.
Ben Bradshaw, it is true that economists in the government do tend to try and persuade ministers of what they think, isn't it?
Well, I mean, our economy is now performing worse than any other economy in the G7, and we were performing best before the referendum. But look, Jacob Rees Mogg didn't challenge the arguments that the Treasury or the civil servants were making. He accused them of deliberately fiddling the figures. That is something completely different. That is a smear on our independent civil service who can't answer back. And as you rightly pointed out, the minister, who first of all agreed with Mr Rees Mogg, then had the grace to apologise in Parliament. And rather than doing that, Mr Rees Mogg, as he also pointed out, is digging himself deeper into the hole, doubling down straight out of the Trump playbook. And, you know, the government, if Theresa May was not so weak, she would be slapping such outrageous behaviour down.
But shouldn't we acknowledge that civil servants do try and get the outcomes that they want? They always have.
No, civil servants, and if you look at the Civil Service Code, it is their duty to give impartial advice to the government. I mean, you may or may not think it's a coincidence that the advice they're giving on the impact of leaving the customs union is almost exactly the same as the government's independent Office of Budget Responsibility and virtually every other independent economist. And yes, we can have a legitimate debate about the economic impacts of leaving the customs union, but this is of a completely different degree. This is accusing civil servants of deliberately lying. And, you know, we have a debate about the customs union. I think this is part of the desperation on part of the hard Brexiteers. They know they're losing the argument on the customs union. There's no majority in Parliament anymore since the election for their extreme version of a hard Brexit. And I suspect they're panicking as a result of that.
Daniel Hannan, respond to that.
Well, I'm not sure what Ben Bradshaw means by extreme hard Brexit. I mean, I was quite in favour of finding an EFTA-type solution. I'm in favour of having a compromise on the transition and on migration. But I think it is crazy to stay in the customs union. That would be about the only outcome that would be worse than staying in, because it would mean that we would give Brussels 100% control over all of our external trade without having any say in what that trade should be. It's very striking to me that all of the countries closest to the EU, which are not in it, so Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, the countries that are in the single market, none of them is interested in joining the customs union, even though they do proportionately way more trade with the EU than we do. We've always been disproportionately hit by it because we do more trade with the rest of the world than other EU countries do. Our consumers are damaged, and some of the poorest producing countries in the world are damaged by EU protectionism. When we leave, we can re-adopt free trade and we can admit produce from some of the poorest countries on the planet and give those people the chance to do what they do best.
It's interesting and very welcome that Mr Cummings says he would favour an EFTA option. Of course, that's something else the government has ruled out. Look, there are trade-offs in all of the different options, and we can have a civilised and rational debate about what those are. The fact is that the government's assessments, which they're now going to be forced to publish thanks to the vote that Labour secured in Parliament last week, show that even under the best scenario, what we gain from the sort of free trade agreements that Mr Cummings has just talked about, we lose far more as a result of losing our access to the markets in Europe. But this is not what Mr Rees Mogg was saying. He wasn't challenging the economic assumptions or having a civilised debate with the economists he disagreed with. He was accusing them of deliberately lying. Public servants, he was accusing them of breaking their civil service code, and that is extremely serious. And rather than doubling down, he should have done the honourable thing, as the minister did, and apologised.
Let me just make clear, it's Daniel Hannan you're talking to, not Dominic Cummings, the Svengali behind the campaign.
We're both politically challenged, but we're definitely different people.
Daniel Hannan, I just want to press you on this EFTA option, which is the Norway option. Do you think Jacob Rees Mogg and his band of European Research Group might come round to supporting an EFTA-type solution for Britain?
As a transition, I think there is a case to be made for it, because then at least you're clearly outside the common agricultural policy, you're clearly outside the common fisheries policy, and you're clearly outside the customs union, right? These EFTA countries are all able to have their own trade deals with China and do. So it is better than what I think is being proposed now, which is that we remain members in everything during the transition, except that we give up our veto rights. I think that is the worst of all worlds. I also think, you know, you've got to reflect the fact that it was a tight result. It was 48-52. We've got to be prepared to try and find a deal that both sides can at least live with. That may go too far for some, not far enough for others, but that we can at least rally round.
Got to leave it there. Daniel Hannan and Ben Bradshaw, thank you both very much.